Cora Williams never imagined that a simple cheek swab would destroy her stepmother's carefully constructed lies and reveal a truth so shocking it would flip her entire world upside down. What started as being kicked out of her father's house in Riverside, California, would end with her stepmother frantically packing bags in the middle of the night, desperate to escape the consequences of secrets she'd buried for over 2 decades. But this story doesn't begin with DNA tests or dramatic confrontations. It begins 3 months earlier, on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning that would set everything in motion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cora Williams had always been an early riser, a trait she'd inherited from her late mother. At 5:47 a.m. on that fateful Tuesday in March, she was already downstairs in the kitchen of her family's Tudor-style home in Riverside, California, grinding coffee beans and preparing for another day at her job as a junior graphic designer at a local marketing firm. The morning routine had become sacred to her, 30 minutes of peace before the rest of the household stirred, time to center herself and prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. She never expected the biggest challenge would come from within her own home. The sound of heels clicking against hardwood floors broke the morning silence. Cora looked up to see her stepmother, Diane Mitchell Williams, descending the staircase with a kind of purposeful stride that meant business. At 51, Diane was the type of woman who commanded attention wherever she went. Perfectly styled auburn hair that never seemed out of place, designer clothes that fit her tall, lean frame like they were custom-made, and a smile that could charm anyone when she chose to use it. This morning, however, there was no smile. "Cora, we need to talk," Diane announced, her voice carrying that authoritative tone she'd perfected during her 15-year career as a real estate broker specializing in luxury properties. Cora paused mid-pour, the rich aroma of Colombian coffee suddenly seeming less appealing. "Good morning to you too, Diane. Dad's still asleep." "This doesn't concern your father," Diane interrupted, pulling out one of the high-backed chairs at their granite kitchen island with more force than necessary. "At least, not yet." The words hung in the air like a threat. Cora had learned to read Diane's moods over the 8 years since her father, Robert Williams, had remarried. There was charming Diane, who appeared whenever Dad was around or when they had company. There was business Diane, who emerged during her real estate dealings and PTA meetings. And then there was cold Diane, the version that only Cora seemed to encounter when they were alone. Today felt different, though. There was something almost predatory in Diane's pale blue eyes, a calculating look that made Cora's stomach clench with unease. "Your living situation. I've been thinking about it," Diane began, her manicured fingers drumming against the granite surface. "You're 23 years old, Cora. Don't you think it's time you started acting like it?" Cora set down her coffee mug with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to process. "I'm not sure what you mean. I have a job. I contribute to household expenses. I help with." "You're a grown woman living in her childhood bedroom. It's not healthy, and frankly, it's not fair to your father and me. We're newlyweds, trying to build a life together." The absurdity of calling themselves newlyweds after 8 years of marriage wasn't lost on Cora, but she bit back the sarcastic response that sprang to mind. Instead, she studied Diane's face, looking for clues about what was really driving this conversation. Diane had never been particularly maternal toward her, but they'd maintained a civil, if distant, relationship. This sudden hostility felt personal. "Where is this coming from?" Cora asked carefully. "Did something happen? Did I do something wrong?" Diane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "It's not about what you did, Cora. It's about what you are." The words hit like a physical blow. Cora felt her cheeks flush with heat, a mixture of confusion and rising anger. "What I am? What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're a constant reminder of your father's past," Diane said, her voice gaining strength and venom with each word. "Every time I look at you, I see her, your mother, the perfect saint that Robert can't stop comparing me to even after all these years." The mention of her mother, Margaret Williams, who had died in a car accident when Cora was 15, sent a surge of protective fury through her chest. "Don't you dare bring my mother into this." "Why not?" Diane stood up, her height giving her a physical advantage that she clearly intended to use. "She's been a ghost in this house since the day I moved in. Her pictures everywhere, her recipes still in the kitchen drawer, her daughter walking around looking exactly like her, reminding your father every single day of what he lost."
Cora's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter. The resemblance to her mother was something she'd always treasured. The same dark brown hair with natural highlights, the same green eyes, the same petite frame and expressive face. Hearing Diane weaponize that resemblance felt like sacrilege. "You're jealous of a dead woman," Cora whispered, the realization hitting her like a revelation. Diane's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw and ugly underneath. "I'm tired of competing with a memory, and I'm tired of pretending that having you here doesn't make my marriage harder than it needs to be." "So, what are you saying exactly?" Cora's voice was steadier now, fueled by a growing determination not to let Diane see how much her words were hurting her. "I'm saying it's time for you to go." Diane reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the granite surface toward Cora. "I found you a nice apartment in downtown Riverside. 1 bedroom, decent neighborhood, affordable for someone with your income. I've already put down the first month's rent and security deposit." Cora stared at the envelope like it was a snake ready to strike. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. The lease starts this weekend. You can thank me later for giving you the push you needed to finally grow up and become independent." The manipulation was so blatant, it was almost impressive. Diane was framing Cora's eviction as a favor, a gift of independence, rather than what it really was, a calculated move to eliminate competition for Robert's attention and affection. "Does Dad know about this?" Cora asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Your father will understand once I explain the situation to him," Diane replied smoothly. "He wants what's best for you, just like I do. Sometimes that means making tough decisions." Cora picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands. Inside would be lease agreements, apartment listings, maybe even a move-out timeline that Diane had probably spent weeks planning. The level of premeditation was staggering. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Cora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've thought of what's best for this family," Diane corrected, "including you." At that moment, Cora heard the familiar creak of footsteps on the stairs. Her father's morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. Up at 6:16, shower by 6:30, downstairs for breakfast by 6:45. In about 30 seconds, Robert Williams would walk into this kitchen expecting to find his usual morning scene. His daughter making coffee, his wife reading the local real estate listings on her tablet, domestic harmony. Instead, he was about to walk into the middle of a family crisis that would test every relationship in the house. Diane immediately shifted gears, her posture relaxing, her expression softening into something that resembled maternal concern. The transformation was so complete and so practiced that Cora felt a chill run down her spine. How many times had she witnessed this performance without recognizing it for what it was? "Remember," Diane said quietly, her voice now honey-sweet, "this is about helping you become independent. Your father doesn't need to be burdened with all the details about why this transition is necessary." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Diane was giving Cora a choice. Go along with the narrative that this was a mutual decision, a natural step toward adulthood, or watch as Diane found ways to make everyone's life more difficult. Robert Williams appeared in the doorway right on schedule, his graying hair still damp from the shower, wearing the navy blue suit that Cora had helped him pick out for his job as an operations manager at a local manufacturing company. At 55, he was still the same gentle, hardworking man who had raised Cora with infinite patience after her mother's death, who had worked double shifts to pay for her college education, who had never missed a single school play or parent-teacher conference. "Morning, ladies," he said, with the warm smile that had always been Cora's anchor in stormy weather. "Something smells good in here." Diane was already moving toward him, rising on her tiptoes to give him a kiss on the cheek. "Just coffee, honey. Cora and I were having a nice chat about her future plans." The casual way she delivered the lie made Cora's blood run cold. This wasn't just about getting her out of the house. This was about controlling the narrative, making sure that when the dust settled, Diane would emerge as the caring stepmother who had simply encouraged her stepdaughter's independence. Robert looked between the two women, his intuitive father's radar clearly detecting tension in the air. "Everything okay?" Cora looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw the slate lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the weight of providing for his family, the genuine happiness that crossed his face whenever he talked about his two favorite ladies. How could she burden him with the truth about what had just happened? How could she force him to choose between his wife and his daughter? The manila envelope felt heavy in her hands, loaded with implications and ultimatums. Diane's eyes were on her, waiting to see which path she would choose. "Dad," Cora began, her voice catching slightly, "Diane and I were just discussing some changes." And in that moment, as she prepared to navigate the most difficult conversation of her life, Cora Williams had no idea that this eviction, painful as it was, would ultimately lead to discoveries that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family, her identity, and the woman who was so determined to remove her from her father's life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The conversation that followed in the kitchen was a masterclass in manipulation, and Cora found herself watching it unfold like a car crash in slow motion. Diane seamlessly wove a narrative that painted Cora's departure as an exciting milestone, a young woman ready to spread her wings and embrace independence. She spoke of the adorable apartment she'd found, the wonderful opportunity for Cora to establish herself as a self-sufficient adult, and how proud she was of Cora's maturity in making this decision. Robert's initial confusion gradually gave way to what appeared to be acceptance, though Cora caught the fleeting moments of doubt that crossed his features. Her father was a good man, but he'd always been trusting to a fault. After Margaret's death, he'd thrown himself into work and single parenthood with such intensity that he'd never really learned to navigate the subtle complexities of emotional manipulation. "I think it's wonderful that you girls worked this out together," he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot Cora had made. "Though, I have to admit, sweetheart, I'm gonna miss having you around." The genuine sadness in his voice nearly broke Cora's resolve. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, to expose Diane's calculated cruelty. Instead, she found herself nodding along with the fiction. "It's time, Dad," she managed to say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I can't live here forever." But even as she played along with Diane's script, something rebellious was taking root in Cora's chest. She wasn't going to make this easy. If Diane wanted her gone, she'd have to work for it. The next 3 days became a subtle war of attrition. Cora began documenting everything, every snide comment, every manipulative conversation, every moment when Diane's mask slipped. She started keeping a voice recorder app running on her phone during their interactions, though she wasn't entirely sure what she planned to do with the evidence. Diane, meanwhile, ramped up her campaign to paint herself as the caring stepmother. She organized a farewell dinner at Riverside's most expensive restaurant, insisted on helping Cora shop for apartment necessities, and made a show of being emotional about the upcoming departure. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the perfect maternal figure, supportive and nurturing. But when Robert wasn't around, the mask came off completely. "You're handling this better than I expected," Diane said on Thursday evening, finding Cora packing boxes in her childhood bedroom. "I thought you might put up more of a fight." Cora continued folding her college sweatshirts, not trusting herself to look up. What would be the point? Exactly. Diane settled herself in the desk chair where Cora had spent countless hours doing homework, studying for exams, and video chatting with friends. The casual way she claimed the space felt like another small violation. "You're finally showing some wisdom." "Is that what you call it?" Cora's hand stilled on a Northwestern University hoodie, a reminder of dreams she'd had to abandon when her father couldn't afford the out-of-state tuition. "I call it accepting reality," Diane replied. "Your father chose me, Cora. He chose to build a future with me. Living in the past, clinging to memories of your mother, keeping this house like some kind of shrine, it's not healthy for any of us." Cora finally looked up at Diane's cold blue eyes. "My mother isn't just a memory to be discarded. She was his wife for 18 years. She was my mom." "Was," Diane emphasized. "Past tense. I'm his wife now, and I have been for 8 years. It's time everyone in this house accepted that." The conversation revealed something Cora hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about jealousy or space or independence. This was about Diane's need to completely erase Margaret's presence from their lives, to rewrite the family's history with herself as the central female figure. "You can't just erase her," Cora said quietly. "Watch me," Diane replied, and there was something so cold, so final in her voice that Cora felt a chill run through her. That night, unable to sleep, Cora found herself in her father's study, surrounded by photo albums and memory boxes that Diane hadn't yet succeeded in banishing to the garage. She pulled out pictures of her parents' wedding day, images of family vacations, snapshots of ordinary moments that meant everything once upon a time. In one photo, her parents were standing in front of the house they had bought together, the same house Cora was now being forced to leave. Her mother was visibly pregnant, glowing with happiness, her hand resting on her rounded belly. Her father's arm was wrapped around her, his face radiant with joy and anticipation.
Cora had seen the photo hundreds of times, but tonight something about it struck her as different. She studied her mother's features more closely, then pulled out a hand mirror from the desk drawer. The resemblance was uncanny, almost too perfect. Same eyes, same nose, same smile. Even the way her mother tilted her head was identical to Cora's own unconscious habit. But as she stared at the reflection, a strange thought began to form. Her parents had been married for 3 years before she was born. She'd always assumed the delay was simply because they'd wanted to establish their careers first, buy a house, become financially stable. But what if there was another reason? She shook off the thought as ridiculous. Grief and stress were making her paranoid, causing her to see mysteries where none existed. Friday morning brought a new development. Cora came downstairs to find Diane on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I told you, it needs to be done before the weekend," Diane was saying. "I don't care what it costs. Just handle it." She ended the call abruptly when she noticed Cora's presence, but not before Cora caught the tail end of what sounded like arrangements being made. "Everything okay?" Cora asked, pouring herself what would be one of her last cups of coffee in this kitchen. "Fine," Diane replied, but there was tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that suggested everything was far from fine, just some real estate business. But Cora had grown up around her father's work in manufacturing and logistics. She recognized the sound of someone coordinating a complex operation. The question was, what kind of operation required such secrecy and urgency? The answer came that afternoon, when Cora returned from her job at the marketing firm to find a crew of workers in the house. They were removing family photos from the hallways, taking down Margaret's artwork from the living room walls, and carefully packing away anything that bore her mother's personal touch. "What's going on?" Cora demanded, finding Diane supervising the operation from the kitchen island. "Spring cleaning," Diane replied without looking up from her tablet. "Your father and I decided it was time to redecorate. Fresh start, new chapter." You can't just throw away Mom's things. I'm not throwing anything away, Diane said with exaggerated patience. Everything is being carefully stored. Your father agreed that it was time to move forward. But Cora knew her father. Even 8 years after Margaret's death, he still wore his original wedding ring on a chain around his neck. He still kept her favorite coffee mug in the cupboard, unwashed and waiting. He would never have agreed to this wholesale erasure of her memory. "Where is he?" Cora asked. "Where's Dad?" "Emergency at the plant," Diane replied smoothly. "He'll be working late. But don't worry, he approved all of this before he left this morning." Another lie, delivered with the same casual confidence as all the others. Cora realized that she was witnessing the methodical dismantling of her family's history, timed perfectly to coincide with her departure. By the time Robert returned home, both his daughter and his late wife's presence would be gone, leaving Diane as the sole feminine influence in his life. The workers continued their systematic removal throughout the afternoon. Cora watched helplessly as they took down the family portrait from the mantel, the last professional photo taken before her mother's death. As they carried it toward the garage, something fell from the back of the frame and skittered across the hardwood floor. Cora quickly retrieved it before anyone else noticed. It was a small envelope, yellowed with age, with her father's name written on the front in her mother's familiar handwriting. Inside was a note dated just days before Margaret's death. "Robert, if anything ever happens to me, there are things about Cora's birth that you need to know. I kept the truth from you to protect our family, but she deserves to know who she really is. The answers are in the safety deposit box at First National. I love you both more than words can say. Margaret." Cora's hands trembled as she read the note again, then a third time. The implications were staggering. Her mother had hidden something about her birth, something significant enough to warrant a deathbed confession that was never delivered. Standing in the chaos of her disappearing childhood home, surrounded by the systematic erasure of her mother's memory, Cora felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. A sense of purpose. Diane might succeed in forcing her out of the house, might even manage to convince Robert that this was all for the best, but she wouldn't succeed in burying the truth. Whatever secrets her mother had kept, whatever answers waited in that safety deposit box, Cora was going to find them, and she suspected that when she did, everything she thought she knew about her family would be revealed as just another carefully constructed lie. The note was still in her hand when Diane appeared beside her, having finished directing the workers. "Find something interesting?" Diane asked, her eyes fixed on the piece of paper with predatory intensity. "Just an old grocery list. Nothing important." But as Diane's eyes narrowed slightly, Cora realized she might have just made her first mistake in what was rapidly becoming a much more dangerous game than she had initially understood.
Saturday morning arrived with the sound of moving trucks rumbling down the quiet street of Maple Grove Lane. Cora stood at her bedroom window, watching the workers load her life into cardboard boxes with mechanical efficiency. The apartment Diane had chosen for her was a modest one-bedroom unit in a converted warehouse downtown, 15 minutes from her job, but a world away from everything she'd ever known. Robert had insisted on helping with the move, despite Diane's subtle suggestions that he had important errands to run. Watching her father carefully wrap her framed college diploma and load her grandmother's antique jewelry box into his truck, Cora felt the weight of Margaret's hidden note pressing against her ribs where she'd tucked it inside her bra, the only place she was certain Diane wouldn't think to look. "You sure you have everything, sweetheart?" Robert asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that meant he was struggling with emotions he didn't know how to express. "I think so, Dad." Cora glanced around her empty childhood bedroom one last time. The walls looked strange without her high school awards and college photos. The furniture is somehow smaller and more anonymous without her personal belongings scattered across every surface. Diane appeared in the doorway carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing what Cora had come to recognize as her performance smile, bright, warm, and completely artificial. I thought we should toast this milestone. Cora's first apartment. It's such an exciting time. The champagne was expensive, Dom Perignon 2012, the kind of bottle Diane typically reserved for closing major real estate deals. The gesture would have seemed generous if Cora hadn't noticed the way Diane's eyes kept darting to her watch, as if she were operating on some invisible timeline. They shared an awkward toast in the empty kitchen, the sound of their glasses clinking echoing strangely in the space that had once been filled with the comfortable chaos of daily life. Robert made a heartfelt speech about being proud of Cora's independence, while Diane nodded along with theatrical enthusiasm. But it was what happened after Robert excused himself to make a work call that revealed Diane's true agenda. "You handled that beautifully. Though I hope you understand that this arrangement isn't temporary." "What do you mean?" "I mean, don't get any ideas about moving back home when things get difficult," Diane clarified, refilling her champagne glass with steady hands. "This isn't a trial run or a gap year adventure. This is permanent." Cora studied her stepmother's face, noting the satisfied gleam in her eyes. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" "I'm enjoying the prospect of finally having a normal marriage, without constant reminders of your father's past cluttering up every room." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Cora like a physical blow, but it also crystallized something important. Diane's need to erase Margaret's memory wasn't just about jealousy, it was about control. By removing both Cora and her mother's belongings from the house, Diane was ensuring that Robert's emotional connections remained solely focused on her. "You know what I find interesting?" Cora said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You've been married to my father for 8 years, but you still feel threatened by a dead woman and her daughter." Diane's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. If your relationship with Dad was as solid as you claim, you wouldn't need to go to such extremes to eliminate the competition." For a moment, Diane's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. The look that crossed her face was pure hatred, raw and undisguised. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper but vibrating with fury. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've endured to build a life with your father." "Then enlighten me," Cora challenged, emboldened by the champagne and her own growing anger. But before Diane could respond, Robert's voice carried down from upstairs, calling for help with something in his study. The moment of truth passed, and Diane's mask slid back into place with practiced ease.
"We should go," Diane said, setting down her glass with deliberate precision. "Your father's waiting, and you have an apartment to settle into." The drive to downtown Riverside was tense, despite Robert's efforts to maintain cheerful conversation. He pointed out landmarks and local restaurants, offering fatherly advice about living alone in the city. Diane remained largely silent, occasionally checking her phone with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was coordinating something complex. The apartment building was a renovated textile warehouse from the 1920s, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures that had been artfully preserved to create authentic urban living. Cora's unit was on the 3rd floor, accessible by a freight elevator that groaned ominously as it carried them up. The space itself was actually quite nice. Hardwood floors, large windows overlooking the city center, a modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances. Under different circumstances, Cora might have been excited about the possibilities it represented. "It's perfect for a young professional," Diane declared, walking through the empty rooms with the confidence of someone who'd personally selected every detail. "And the lease is very reasonable." But as Robert helped carry boxes up from the truck, Cora began noticing details that didn't quite add up. The lease agreement listed the security deposit as $2,400, far more than someone on Cora's salary could reasonably afford. The rental application had been submitted 6 weeks ago, long before their kitchen confrontation. Most telling of all was the way the building manager, Mrs. Patterson, seemed to know Diane personally. "Miss Mitchell Williams has been so helpful throughout this process," Mrs. Patterson gushed as she handed over the keys. "She really went above and beyond to make sure everything was perfect for your daughter." The use of Diane's maiden name, which she only used for real estate transactions, confirmed Cora's suspicions. This wasn't a spontaneous decision motivated by Cora's need for independence. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in motion for weeks, possibly months. As they finished unloading boxes, Cora's phone rang. The caller ID showed her best friend from college, Jessica Chen, who was currently working as a paralegal in Los Angeles. "Hey, stranger!" Jessica's cheerful voice provided a welcome distraction from the tension. "How's the move going?" "Complicated," Cora replied, stepping out onto the apartment's small balcony for privacy. "I'll call you later with details." "Wait, before you go, I wanted to run something by you. My firm is looking for someone with graphic design experience to help with trial presentations and client materials. The pay is great, and it would get you back to California. Interested?" The offer was exactly what Cora would have wanted a week ago, a chance to escape Riverside, to start fresh somewhere new, to build a career in a bigger market. But now, with Margaret's note burning like a secret in her pocket, leaving felt like abandoning an important mission. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course, but don't wait too long. They want to fill the position by the end of the month." As Cora hung up, she realized that Diane had positioned herself near the balcony door and had clearly been listening to at least part of the conversation. "Job opportunity?" Diane asked with studied casualness. "Maybe," Cora replied, not trusting herself to say more. "Los Angeles is a wonderful city for someone your age. So many opportunities, so much culture, much better than staying stuck in a small city like Riverside." The encouragement felt wrong. Too eager, too calculated. Why would Diane want her to move even further away unless there was something in Riverside that she was desperate to keep hidden? By evening, Robert had returned home, and Cora was alone in her new apartment, surrounded by boxes and the echoing silence of unfamiliar space. She ordered Chinese takeout from a restaurant down the street and sat on her one piece of furniture, a folding chair she'd bought at a drugstore, staring out at the city lights. The note from her mother seemed to pulse with urgency in her pocket. Whatever secrets Margaret had kept, whatever truth she had hidden about Cora's birth, the answers were waiting at First National Bank, in a safety deposit box that had been locked away for 8 years. But accessing a safety deposit box required more than just knowing it existed. She would need her mother's key, if it still existed, or legal documentation proving her right to access the contents. More importantly, she would need to do it without alerting Diane to her investigation. As she unpacked her laptop and set it up on her kitchen counter, Cora began researching the legal requirements for accessing deceased persons' safety deposit boxes in California. The information was complex and bureaucratic, but one thing became clear. If her mother had listed her as an authorized user on the box, she could access it with proper identification and a death certificate. The death certificate would be easy enough to obtain from the county records office. The real question was whether Margaret had been forward-thinking enough to grant her daughter access, or if the secrets she'd tried to confess would remain locked away forever. Around midnight, as Cora was finally drifting off to sleep on an air mattress in her empty bedroom, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Some truths are better left buried." Cora sat up in the darkness, her heart pounding. The message could have come from anyone, but the timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. Someone knows she'd found Margaret's note. Someone was watching her closely enough to know that she was asking questions. The question was, how far would they go to keep those secrets buried?
The threatening text message haunted Cora through a restless Sunday morning. She'd screenshotted it, analyzed the phone number, which led nowhere, a burner phone most likely, and even considered taking it to the police. But what would she tell them? That her stepmother had kicked her out and now someone was sending vague warnings about digging into the past? By noon, she'd made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of retreating or calling Jessica back about the Los Angeles job, she was going to visit the one person who might have answers about her mother's secrets, Eleanor Martinez, Margaret's former best friend, and the closest thing Cora had ever had to an aunt. Eleanor lived in a craftsman bungalow in the historic district of Riverside, about 20 minutes from Cora's new apartment. She was a retired English teacher who had known Margaret since their college days at UC Riverside, and she was also the one person Diane had never managed to charm or intimidate. Cora hadn't seen Eleanor in almost 2 years, a fact that now struck her as suspicious. Growing up, Eleanor had been a constant presence in their lives, hosting holiday dinners when Robert was working overtime, helping with school projects, taking Cora shopping for prom dresses. But sometime after Diane entered the picture, those visits had become less frequent, then stopped altogether. The woman who answered the door looked older than Cora remembered, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. But her face lit up with genuine joy when she recognized her visitor. "Cora! My God, look at you!" Eleanor exclaimed, pulling her into a fierce hug that smelled of lavender and old books. "I was wondering when you'd finally come see me." "Finally?" Cora pulled back, studying Eleanor's face. "What do you mean?" "Come in, honey. We have a lot to talk about." Eleanor's living room was exactly as Cora remembered. Overstuffed bookshelves lining every wall, a comfortable couch covered in hand-knitted throws, and a coffee table that always seemed to hold a pot of tea and whatever novel Eleanor was currently reading. But what struck Cora now were the photographs scattered throughout the room. There were dozens of pictures of Margaret, far more than she remembered being there during her childhood visits. "I've been waiting 8 years for you to ask the right questions," Eleanor said, settling into her favorite armchair with a sigh. "Your mother made me promise to wait until you were ready, but honestly, I was starting to think that day would never come." Cora's heart began to race. "Mom made you promise what, exactly?" Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then reached into the drawer of her end table and pulled out a sealed envelope with Cora's name written across the front in Margaret's familiar handwriting. "She left this with me the week before she died," Eleanor said quietly, "along with very specific instructions about when I was supposed to give it to you." Cora's hands trembled as she took the envelope. "What kind of instructions?" "She said I should wait until one of 2 things happened. Either you came to me asking questions about your birth, or Diane tried to remove you from your father's life." Eleanor's expression darkened. "Given that you're here on a Sunday afternoon looking like you haven't slept in days, I'm guessing it was the latter." The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. Cora turned it over in her hands, noting that it had never been opened. "You knew," she said, looking up at Eleanor. "You knew Diane would eventually try to get rid of me." "Your mother knew," Eleanor corrected. "Margaret was always intuitive about people, but Diane? Margaret saw right through her from the beginning. She tried to warn your father, but grief makes people vulnerable to manipulation." Cora thought about all the times Eleanor's visits had suddenly stopped, all the invitations that had been declined, all the phone calls that had gone unreturned. "Diane kept you from us." "She tried," Eleanor admitted, "but I've been watching from a distance, keeping tabs on you and your father. Did you think it was coincidence that your college applications somehow found their way to the admissions offices, even when the deadlines had passed? Or that scholarship opportunities kept appearing in your email inbox?" The revelation hit Cora like a physical blow. "That was you?" she said. "Your mother asked me to look out for you, especially if something happened to her. She was terrified that Robert would fall under the influence of the wrong person, someone who would try to erase her memory and push you out of the family."
Eleanor gestured toward a bookshelf lined with photo albums. "She documented everything, Cora. Every milestone, every achievement, every important moment of your life. She wanted to make sure there would always be a record, even if—" her voice trailed off meaningfully. "Even if Diane tried to erase it all," Cora finished.
Your mother was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. She knew her time was limited. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. What do you mean she knew her time was limited? The accident was random, wasn't it? A drunk driver running a red light? Eleanor's expression grew carefully neutral. What does the letter say? Cora's fingers worked to open the envelope, her movements clumsy with anticipation and dread. Inside were 3 pages of her mother's handwriting, along with a small brass key attached to a keychain shaped like a heart. My dearest Cora, if Eleanor is giving you this, then my worst fears about your future have come to pass. I pray that I'm wrong, that you're reading this as an adult who simply became curious about family history. But if Diane has forced you out of our home, if she's trying to erase my memory from your father's life, then you need to know the truth about who you are and why she sees you as such a threat. Cora's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Eleanor, who was watching her with patient, knowing eyes. She knew about Diane before Dad even met her? Keep reading, Eleanor said gently. The truth is that Robert is not your biological father, though he has loved you as his own daughter since the day you were born. Your real father was a man named Marcus Chen, a fellow graduate student I knew before I met Robert. Marcus died in a motorcycle accident 3 months before you were born, never knowing he was going to be a father. The words seemed to swim on the page. Cora read the paragraph again, then a 3rd time, but the meaning remained the same. Robert Williams, the man who had raised her, loved her, sacrificed for her education and happiness, was not her biological father. I don't understand, she whispered. There's more, Eleanor said softly. I never told Robert the truth because it didn't matter to me, and I knew it wouldn't matter to him. He chose to love you before you were even born, chose to be your father in every way that counts. But legally, biologically, you are not his child. This is why Diane sees you as an outsider, why she believes she can convince Robert to choose his real family over his inherited obligations. Cora's mind reeled. The resemblance to Margaret that Diane had weaponized, the features that made her a constant reminder of Robert's first wife, none of it meant what she'd always believed it meant. If you're reading this, if Diane has succeeded in driving you away, then you need proof of what I'm telling you. In our safety deposit box at First National Bank, the key is with this letter, you'll find your original birth certificate listing Marcus Chen as your father, DNA test results I had done when you were 5, I needed to be sure for your medical history, and legal documents that establish Robert's adoption of you as his own child. Adoption? Cora looked up at Eleanor again. Dad adopted me? Legally, yes, but not until you were 7 years old. Your mother kept putting off the paperwork, afraid that making it official would somehow diminish the natural bond Robert had formed with you. By the time she realized how important those documents might become, she was already sick. Cora's world felt like it was tilting off its axis. Everything she'd believed about her identity, her family, her place in the Williams household was built on a foundation she'd never known existed. There's something else, Eleanor said quietly, reaching for another envelope from her drawer. This came for you yesterday, hand-delivered. The envelope was unmarked except for Cora's name written in block letters that were clearly disguised. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made her blood run cold. Your mother's accident wasn't as random as everyone believes. Stop asking questions about the past, or you might discover that accidents run in families. Cora's hand shook as she read the words again. Eleanor, this is threatening my life. Which means you're getting close to something someone doesn't want you to find. The question is, are you brave enough to see this through, or are you going to let whoever sent this scare you into running away? Looking at her mother's letter, at the brass key that would unlock 8 years of buried secrets, at the photographs of Margaret that filled Eleanor's living room like a shrine to stolen time, Cora felt something crystallize inside her chest. Fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something stronger,
determination. "I need to get into that safety deposit box," she said. Eleanor smiled for the first time since Cora's arrival, and it was fierce and proud. "Then we'd better call David Park. You're going to need a lawyer." Monday morning found Cora sitting in the downtown office of David Park, attorney at law, clutching her mother's letter and the brass key that had already changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Park's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building with tall windows overlooking the Santa Ana River and walls lined with law books that looked like they'd actually been read rather than purchased for decoration. David Park himself was not what Cora had expected. She'd imagined someone older, more traditional, but the man who greeted her was probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind trendy glasses and the sort of casual confidence that came from years of handling delicate family situations. "Eleanor called me last night," he said, settling behind his desk with a steaming mug of coffee. "She explained the basics, but I'd like to hear your side of the story before we proceed." Cora found herself telling him everything. Diane's eviction ultimatum, the systematic removal of her mother's belongings, the discovery of Margaret's notes, and the increasingly threatening messages she'd been receiving. Park listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "The threatening messages concern me most," he said when she finished. "Have you considered going to the police?" "With what evidence? Anonymous texts and a feeling that my stepmother is hiding something? You'd be surprised how seriously law enforcement takes stalking and intimidation these days," Park replied. "But let's focus on what we can prove. The adoption paperwork your mother mentioned. I remember that case well. Your father was so determined to make it official, to ensure there could never be any question about his rights as your parent." He pulled a thick file from his cabinet, the tab labeled Williams, Robert, Adoption Proceedings. "Technically, the adoption was finalized when you were 7, but Robert had been acting as your legal guardian since your mother's marriage to him. The delay was purely administrative. Your mother kept postponing the final paperwork for reasons she never fully explained to me." But Cora thought about Margaret's letter, about her mother's fear that making the adoption official might somehow diminish the natural bond between Robert and his daughter. It was such a typically selfless concern, protecting everyone else's feelings, even when it might have left Cora legally vulnerable. "What does the adoption mean in practical terms?" she asked. "It means that, legally, you are Robert Williams' daughter in every sense. You have inheritance rights, medical decision-making rights, all the protections that biological children enjoy. Your stepmother can't simply erase you from the family, no matter what she might believe about blood relations." The relief Cora felt was overwhelming. For the past few days, she'd been carrying the fear that Diane might somehow convince Robert that their relationship was less legitimate because they didn't share DNA. "However," Park continued, "there are some complications we need to address. The safety deposit box, for instance. Your mother listed you as an authorized user when you turned 18, but she never updated her address on file. The bank has been sending notices to your old apartment, the one you shared with roommates during college." "Notices about what?" "Unpaid box rental fees. The bank was preparing to drill the box and auction its contents when I intervened on your mother's estate's behalf last month." Cora's heart skipped a beat. "Last month? But Mom died 8 years ago. Why would they suddenly—" Park's expression darkened. "Someone has been paying the rental fees for years, keeping the box active. But last month, those payments stopped. The bank received a letter supposedly from your mother's estate requesting that the box be opened and its contents disposed of." "Someone was trying to destroy the evidence," Cora breathed. "That's my assumption. Fortunately, I still had power of attorney for certain matters related to your mother's estate, so I was able to stop the process. But we need to access that box soon, before whoever's been manipulating the situation finds another way to get to those documents." They drove to First National Bank in Park's BMW, taking a circuitous route that he claimed was to ensure they weren't being followed. I had initially thought he was being paranoid, but I had noticed the same black SUV behind us for the past 10 minutes, maintaining just enough distance to avoid being obvious. "Don't look back," Park said quietly, apparently having noticed the same thing. "Just act natural."
The bank was an imposing granite building from the 1920s, with marble floors and the kind of old-fashioned teller windows that made banking feel like a formal occasion. Park handled the paperwork with practiced efficiency, while Cora tried to calm her racing heart. The safety deposit box was larger than she'd expected, about the size of a shoebox, and surprisingly heavy when the bank employee handed it to her in the private viewing room. Her hands trembled as she inserted her mother's key and turned it. Inside were documents that would reshape her understanding of everything. Her original birth certificate listing Marcus Chen as her father, DNA test results confirming Robert was not her biological parent, Robert's adoption paperwork, and, most shocking of all, a thick manila folder labeled Insurance Investigation, Margaret Williams. "What's this?" she asked, pulling out the folder. Park's face went pale as he scanned the first few pages. "It's a private investigator's report. Your mother hired someone to look into her own accident." The report was dated just 2 weeks before Margaret's death, commissioned by Margaret herself through a PI firm in Los Angeles. The investigator, a woman named Sandra Reeves, had been looking into inconsistencies in the police report of Margaret's accident, inconsistencies that Margaret had apparently noticed herself. According to Reeves' findings, the drunk driver who had hit Margaret's car had been in a bar just 30 minutes before the accident. Security footage showed him drinking alone, appearing increasingly agitated while repeatedly checking his phone. The footage also showed him receiving what appeared to be a significant amount of cash from someone off camera just before leaving the bar. "This suggests the accident might have been planned," Park said grimly. "Someone paid that man to get drunk and target your mother's car." But the most damning evidence was a series of photographs taken by the investigator showing Diane entering and leaving a downtown law office, the same office that represented the drunk driver in his eventual plea negotiations. She was involved. Diane was involved in my mother's death. "These are serious allegations," Park cautioned, though his expression suggested he was reaching the same conclusion. "But this investigator, Sandra Reeves, she might have more information. According to this, your mother was supposed to meet with her the day after the accident occurred." They spent another hour going through the documents, finding financial records that showed unusual insurance payouts, correspondence between Margaret and the PI, and most significantly, a handwritten will that Margaret had drafted just days before her death, a will that left everything to Cora, with Robert as executor, and specifically excluded any spouse Robert may acquire after my death. "Diane doesn't know about this will," Park realized. "She's been operating under the assumption that she would inherit as Robert's wife." "But wouldn't Dad know about it?" "Not if your mother hid it here for safety. She may have been planning to tell him after the investigation was complete, after she had proof of what she suspected." As they prepared to leave the bank, Cora's phone buzzed with the text from her father. "Can you come by the house tonight? Diane's making your favorite lasagna. She wants to make sure there are no hard feelings about the move." The invitation felt wrong, too convenient given what they'd just discovered, but it also represented an opportunity. "I need to go," she told Park as they walked back to his car. "I need to see how she reacts to me now that I know the truth." "That's incredibly dangerous. If she was involved in your mother's death, then she's not going to try anything with Dad there," Cora interrupted. "Besides, I need to warn him. If Diane is capable of murder, he could be in danger too." Park looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Cora's expression must have convinced him. "At least let me contact Sandra Reeves first. If she's still alive, she might have additional evidence. And Cora, be careful. People who are desperate enough to kill once usually won't hesitate to do it again." As they drove back through downtown Riverside, the black SUV appeared in Park's rearview mirror again. This time, it followed them all the way to Cora's apartment building before finally disappearing into traffic. That evening, as Cora prepared for dinner at her childhood home, she tucked a small digital recorder into her pocket. If Diane was going to confess to anything, or if she revealed more about her plans, Cora wanted evidence. She also sent Eleanor a text with her location and asked her to call the police if she didn't check in by 10 p.m. Standing outside the Tudor-style house where she'd grown up, looking at the warm light spilling from windows that no longer held her mother's photographs, Cora felt a mixture of fear and determination. Inside was the woman who had stolen her father, erased her mother's memory, and possibly committed murder to protect her secrets. But inside was also Robert Williams, the man who had chosen to be her father when he didn't have to, who had loved her unconditionally for 23 years, and who deserved to know the truth about the woman he'd married. The question was, would Cora be able to expose Diane's lies without putting her father or herself in mortal danger?
The familiar smell of garlic and herbs filled the house as Cora approached the front door at 7 p.m. sharp. Through the window, she could see Diane moving around the kitchen with theatrical domesticity, wearing the floral apron that had once belonged to Margaret. Another small violation that would have gone unnoticed before, but now felt like a deliberate provocation. Robert opened the door with the warm smile that had been Cora's anchor through every storm of her life. But tonight she noticed the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry invisible weight. "There's my girl," he said, pulling her into a hug that felt desperate somehow, as if he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "I've missed having you around the house." "I missed you too, Dad." The endearment felt both natural and strange, now that she knew the biological truth. But as she looked into his eyes, the same gentle brown eyes that had checked for monsters under her bed, that had beamed with pride at every graduation and achievement, she realized that DNA was just science. Love was what made a family. Diane appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, and for just a moment, her mask of cheerful hospitality slipped. Cora caught a flash of something predatory in her stepmother's expression before it was replaced by a bright smile. "Cora, perfect timing! I just took the lasagna out of the oven." Diane wiped her hands on Margaret's apron, the gesture somehow managing to be both domestic and menacing. "I hope you're hungry." The dining room table was set with Margaret's good china, the wedding pattern that Diane had previously claimed was too formal for everyday use. Tonight's usage felt like a statement, as if Diane were claiming ownership of every piece of Margaret's legacy. As they settled around the table, Cora activated the recording app on her phone and positioned it strategically next to her water glass. The device was small enough to be unnoticeable, but sensitive enough to pick up conversation from across the table. "So," Robert said, serving himself a generous portion of lasagna, "how's the new apartment? Getting settled okay?" "It's an adjustment," Cora replied carefully, watching Diane's face for reactions. "Though I have to admit, I've been wondering about some things lately. Family history, you know? Things Mom might have told me if she'd had more time." Diane's fork paused halfway to her mouth, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of things, sweetheart?" The endearment sounded wrong coming from Diane's lips, loaded with false affection. "Oh, just stories about when I was little, medical history from my new doctor, that sort of thing." "Your father would know more about that than I would," Diane said, deflecting smoothly. "I didn't meet you until you were already 15. But Robert was frowning slightly, as if trying to recall something just out of reach. "You know, it's funny, I was going through some old paperwork the other day looking for the house insurance documents, and I came across some things of your mother's that I'd forgotten about." Diane went very still. "What kind of things?" "Legal documents, mostly. Some correspondence I'd never seen before." Robert's voice was casual, but Cora caught the undercurrent of confusion, maybe even suspicion. "Did you know Margaret hired a private investigator right before she died?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Diane's face went pale, but she managed a laugh that sounded forced even to Cora's ears. "A private investigator? That's absurd. Why would she do something like that?" "That's what I was wondering," Robert continued, his tone growing more pointed, "especially since some of the documents mentioned irregularities in her accident investigation. Almost like she suspected." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Cora felt a surge of hope.
Maybe her father was already starting to piece together the truth on his own. Suspected what? Diane's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. That maybe the accident wasn't as random as everyone believed. The silence that followed was deafening. Diane set down her fork with exaggerated care, her hands visibly trembling now. Robert, I think grief might be making you see conspiracies where none exist. Margaret's death was a tragedy, but it was just that, a random accident caused by a drunk driver. Then why, Robert asked quietly, did the investigator's report mention your name? Cora's heart stopped. Her father had found Sandra Reeves' report, but that meant you went to the safety deposit box, Diane said, and there was no longer any pretense of warmth in her voice. You accessed Margaret's box. I had every right, Robert replied, his tone hardening. I was her husband. I'm the executor of her estate.
What estate? Diane snapped, her mask finally dropping completely. She left everything to me when we got married. Community property laws. Actually, Robert interrupted, she didn't. There's a will, Diane. A will that specifically excludes any future spouse from inheritance. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, a copy of Margaret's hidden will. Everything goes to Cora, with me as executor until she turns 25. The transformation in Diane was terrifying. The woman who had spent 8 years playing the role of grieving widow and devoted stepmother was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating and desperate. That will is invalid, she hissed. I'll contest it. No court would uphold a document that wasn't properly witnessed. It was witnessed, Robert said calmly, by Eleanor Martinez and David Park, both of whom are still alive and prepared to testify to its authenticity. Cora watched this confrontation with growing dread. Her father had clearly been investigating on his own, had already discovered many of the same truths she'd uncovered, but he didn't know how dangerous Diane could be when cornered. Dad, she said carefully, maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere else. No. Diane stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. We're going to finish this right here, right now. Robert, you have no idea what I've sacrificed for this family, what I've done to protect our future together. Protect our future? Robert's voice was incredulous. Diane, if these documents are accurate, you were involved in Margaret's death. You paid someone to kill my wife. I didn't pay anyone to kill her, Diane exploded, and Cora realized with horror that this was as close to a confession as they were likely to get. I paid him to scare her, to make her back off from the investigation. The crash was supposed to be minor, just enough to distract her, make her focus on recovery instead of digging into things that were none of her business. The admission hung in the air like poison. Robert's face had gone white, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles showed. She was investigating you, he said slowly. But Margaret found out about something you'd done. She found out that I loved you first, Diane said, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. She found out that I was the one who introduced myself to you at that stupid faculty mixer, that I was the one who spent months trying to get your attention. But you barely noticed me because you were so devoted to your perfect little wife. Cora felt sick. The story she'd heard her entire life, that her parents had met at a university event and fallen in love at first sight, had been built on lies. Diane had been there first, had wanted Robert first, and had spent years watching him choose Margaret instead. So, when Margaret got sick, Robert said, his voice hollow with understanding, when she was vulnerable, when she was dying, Diane corrected, I was there for you. I helped you through the worst time of your life. I earned my place in this family. By arranging her murder? By trying to stop her from destroying everything we'd built together. Diane was crying now, but her tears felt manipulative rather than genuine. She was going to expose things about my past, about mistakes I'd made before I met you. She was going to ruin us. Cora's recording device was capturing every word, but she was beginning to realize that evidence might not matter if they didn't survive this conversation. Diane had moved to the kitchen doorway, blocking their most direct exit from the house. What mistakes? Robert asked,
though he could see in his face that he was afraid of the answer. The Henderson account. I may have adjusted some figures, moved some money around. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I could secure the promotion that would put us in a better financial position. You embezzled money from your real estate clients? I borrowed it. I was going to pay it back once you married me and gained access to Margaret's life insurance payout. That's what this was all about. Money. It was about love, she insisted, but even she seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. Everything I did was because I loved you. Cora stood slowly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. Dad, we need to leave, now. But Diane had noticed her movement, and when she turned toward Cora, her expression was pure hatred. This is all your fault, she said, her voice deadly quiet. If you had just stayed away, if you had taken that job in Los Angeles like you were supposed to, none of this would have happened. You knew about Jessica's job offer, Cora realized. You were trying to get me out of town. I was trying to save your life, Diane replied, and reached into the kitchen drawer behind her. The knife she withdrew was one of Margaret's good carving knives, the steel blade gleaming under the dining room chandelier. Robert jumped to his feet, putting himself between Diane and Cora. Diane, put that down. We can work this out. No, we can't, she said, and Cora heard the finality in her voice. Too many people know now. The lawyer, Eleanor, that investigator if she's still alive. The only way this ends quietly is if Cora has an accident, just like her mother did. In that moment, Cora understood that they weren't going to talk their way out of this. Diane had spent 8 years building a life based on lies and murder, and she wasn't going to let it all crumble without a fight. The woman who had served lasagna on her dead wife's china, who had worn her apron and slept in her bed and tried to erase every trace of her memory, was prepared to kill again to protect her secrets. And this time, there would be no drunk driver to take the blame.
Time seemed to slow as Diane raised the carving knife, her face twisted with desperate fury. But before she could take a step toward them, the front door burst open with a crash that shook the entire house. Riverside Police, drop your weapon. Detective Maria Santos and 3 uniformed officers flooded into the dining room, guns drawn and trained on Diane. Behind them came Eleanor Martinez, her face pale but determined, clutching her cell phone like a lifeline. I called them the moment you texted me your location, Eleanor said breathlessly to Cora. Sandra Reeves contacted me an hour ago. She's been in witness protection for 8 years because of what she discovered about Margaret's death. Diane's knife clattered to the floor as the reality of her situation crashed over her. The officers moved quickly to secure the weapon and place her in handcuffs, but she was staring at Eleanor with undisguised hatred. You meddling old witch, she spat. This was none of your business. Margaret was my best friend, Eleanor replied steadily. Making sure her killer faced justice was absolutely my business. Detective Santos, a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, looked between Robert and Cora. Are either of you injured? No, Robert managed, though he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. But she confessed. She admitted to arranging Margaret's death to embezzling money from her clients. We heard, Santos replied. We've been listening to the wire Miss Martinez was wearing when she entered the house. Cora looked at Eleanor in amazement. You were wearing a wire? Sandra Reeves contacted me this morning after David Park reached out to her. She's been monitoring Diane's activities from a distance for years, waiting for enough evidence to bring charges. When she learned you'd accessed the safety deposit box, she knew Diane would become desperate. As the officers led Diane toward the door, she turned back one last time, her eyes finding Cora's across the room. You have no idea who you really are, she said, her voice carrying a strange note of satisfaction despite her circumstances. Marcus Chen wasn't just some random graduate student. Ask your precious Eleanor what she's been hiding about your real father. The words hit like a physical blow, and Cora saw Eleanor's face go white. But before anyone could respond, Diane was gone,
loaded into a police cruiser that disappeared into the night with flashing lights. Detective Santos spent the next 2 hours taking their statements, collecting evidence, and explaining the investigation that had been building around Diane for months. Sandra Reeves emerged from witness protection and joined them via video call, her face gaunt but her voice steady, as she detailed years of careful surveillance. Diane Mitchell wasn't her real name, Reeves explained. She was born Diana Kozlov in Portland, Oregon. She's been running financial scams for over 15 years, moving from city to city, changing identities when things got too hot. Robert, you weren't her first wealthy widower target. The revelation that his 8-year marriage had been built on an elaborate con seemed to break something inside Robert. He sat in his living room armchair, the same chair where he'd read bedtime stories to Cora decades ago, staring at nothing while the police processed the crime scene around him. But it was Eleanor who provided the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would reshape Cora's understanding of herself completely. Marcus Chen, Eleanor said quietly after the police had left and they were alone in the house. Diane was right that there's more to that story than your mother told you. Cora felt a familiar chill of dread. What do you mean? Marcus wasn't just any graduate student. He was Dr. Marcus Chen, a brilliant researcher in biochemistry who was working on cancer treatments at USC. He was also, Eleanor paused, taking a shaky breath, he was also Robert's best friend from college. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert looked up from his chair, confusion and dawning realization warring in his expression. Marcus Chen, he repeated slowly. I haven't heard that name and, my God, that was 24 years ago. You knew him? Cora whispered. He was my roommate at UC Riverside, Robert said, his voice hollow with memory. We stayed in touch after graduation, but then he moved to Los Angeles for his graduate program and we drifted apart. I heard about his motorcycle accident through mutual friends. Such a waste. He was going to change the world. Eleanor nodded grimly. Marcus met her at a conference she attended with Robert. Marcus was presenting his research, and Margaret was there supporting her husband's career. But something happened between them, a connection that went beyond professional interest. An affair, Cora said, the word feeling strange and painful on her tongue. A brief one, Eleanor confirmed. Your mother was going through a difficult period in her marriage. Robert was working 16-hour days trying to establish himself in his career, and Margaret felt isolated and forgotten. Marcus was brilliant, charming, and most importantly, he paid attention to her. Robert's face had gone ashen. She never told me.
She ended it after 2 weeks, Eleanor continued. She realized that what she really needed was to fix her marriage, not escape from it. She came home determined to rebuild her relationship with Robert, to be the wife and partner she deserved. But she was already pregnant, Cora said. She didn't know at first. By the time she realized, Marcus was dead and she and Robert had rekindled their love. She made a choice to let Robert believe you were his biological daughter, because in every way that mattered, you were. Robert stood up slowly, walking to the mantel where Margaret's pictures had once stood. She carried that secret for 15 years. She carried it to protect all of you, Eleanor said firmly. Robert, you were Cora's father from the moment she was born. You changed her diapers, walked the floors with her when she had colic, taught her to ride a bicycle. Biology is just science. Love is what makes a family. Cora found herself thinking about the past 23 years, about every moment of unconditional love and support Robert had given her. The man who had sacrificed his own dreams to pay for her education, who had worked double shifts to afford dance lessons and summer camps, who had never once made her feel like anything less than his beloved daughter. I'm still your dad, Cora said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Nothing about that changes. I know, Cora replied, and she meant it completely. You're the only father I've ever wanted. 3 months later, Cora stood in the courthouse as Diane, whose real name turned out to be Diana Kozlov, was sentenced to 25 years to life for the murder of Margaret Williams. The embezzlement charges had been added on, along with fraud, identity theft, and a dozen other crimes uncovered during the investigation. Sandra Reeves had emerged from witness protection to testify, revealing years of evidence she'd gathered about Diane's criminal activities across multiple states. The drunk driver who had killed Margaret broke down on the witness stand, admitting he'd been paid $5,000 to scare the woman in the blue Honda, but claiming he never intended for the crash to be fatal. Robert had started therapy to process the trauma of discovering his marriage had been built on lies and murder. Eleanor had moved into the guest room temporarily, helping him sort through the emotional wreckage while supporting Cora as she processed her own identity crisis. The house on Maple Grove Lane was slowly coming back to life. Margaret's photographs returned to their places of honor, her recipes found their way back into the kitchen drawer, and the family portrait reclaimed its spot on the mantel. It was as if the house itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Cora had decided to stay in Riverside, turning down Jessica's job offer in Los Angeles. Her apartment downtown had become a haven where she could process everything that had happened while remaining close to Robert and Eleanor. She'd also started volunteering with the Victims' Rights Organization, helping other families navigate the complex emotions of betrayal and loss. On a warm evening in June, exactly 1 year after Diane's eviction ultimatum, Cora found herself back in her childhood home's kitchen, making coffee with her father while Eleanor prepared dinner. The scene was both familiar and completely different. They were still a family, but they were also 3 people who had survived something terrible together. "I got a call from David Park today," Robert said, measuring coffee grounds with the same precision he'd used every morning for decades. "The insurance companies have finished their investigations. They're releasing Margaret's life insurance payout. All of it." "That's good news," Cora replied, though money felt irrelevant after everything they'd been through. "It's more than good news. It's enough to pay off the house, fund your mother's scholarship foundation like she always wanted, and still leave enough for your future." He paused, meeting her eyes. "She really did think of everything, didn't she?" "She protected us even after she was gone," Cora agreed. As they sat down to dinner, Eleanor's famous pot roast, served on Margaret's good china because life was too short to save special things for occasions that might never come, Cora reflected on how much had changed in a single year. She'd learned that her identity was more complex than she had ever imagined, that the man who raised her wasn't her biological father, but absolutely was her real father in every way that mattered. She discovered that her mother's death wasn't a random tragedy, but a calculated murder designed to silence her investigation into financial crimes. She'd watched her stepmother transform from a cold manipulator into a desperate killer, and she'd seen that desperation ultimately lead to justice. Most importantly, she'd learned that family wasn't about DNA or legal documents or shared genetics. Family was about the people who chose to love you, who stood by you when the world fell apart, who fought for you even when it cost them everything. Robert Williams had chosen to be her father 23 years ago, and he chose to be her father every day since. That choice, made freely, maintained lovingly, never regretted despite the revelation of her true parentage, was worth more than any biological connection could ever be. As thunder rumbled in the distance and rain began to patter against the windows, Cora realized she was exactly where she belonged. Not because of blood or obligation or legal documents, but because of love, the kind of love that transcends DNA and survives even the most devastating betrayals. The DNA test results that had set everything in motion were locked away in David Park's office now, evidence in a case closed. But the truth they'd revealed about family, about love, about the courage it takes to fight for the people you care about would stay with Cora for the rest of her life. She was Cora Williams, daughter of Robert Williams, legacy of Margaret Williams, and survivor of Diana Kozlov's cruelty. And she was finally, truly home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.